Tonight on Talking Politics, I'm Saraya Wintersmith in for Adam Riley, and we're looking at an issue that's been discussed in political circles without much real traction for more than 150 years, reparations. A little later, we'll take a deep dive into a proposal that's been put forth here in Boston and some of the many questions surrounding that. But first, a little background on how we got where we are today. The nation's first attempt at reparations came in 1865, when Union Army General William T. Sherman issued a Civil War-time order, a suggestion from a group of 20 black ministers he met with in Savannah, Georgia. It was supposed to take around 400,000 acres of Confederate land and divvy it up among newly freed black families, up to 40 acres each. Just a few months later, after President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, President Andrew Johnson overturned that order. But the idea has lived on. In 1989, Congressman John Conyers, Jr. of Michigan introduced a bill that sought to create a commission to study the effects of slavery and racial discrimination and suggest appropriate remedies in response. The congressman introduced that resolution, named H.R. 40 in honor of those 40 acres, every session for nearly 3 decades.
Reparations now. Reparations not in the next century, not in 2185.
But it wasn't until almost 20 years after that speech, in April of last year, that H.R. 40 finally made it out of committee, and not without heated debate.
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea.
What this committee must know is that while emancipation deadbolted the door against the bandits of America, Jim Crow wedged the windows wide open. And that is the thing about Senator McConnell's something. It was 150 years ago, and it was right now.
Anybody who grew up during the 50s and 60s understands what the greatest generation looked like, and they were not people who felt sorry for themselves, and they would be upset to hear that they've been looked at as victims today.
Underlying the generational trauma and exploitation is a government that abandoned its role to protect its own citizens, a government that refused to even acknowledge the humanity of my ancestors, a government that to this day refuses to acknowledge or atone for the wrongdoings of white supremacist violence.
Now, almost a year later, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has announced she has the votes to pass H.R. 40 before the full House.
It is America's original sin, and absolutely it must be responded to. And there may be different ways that it is done, but I can assure you it will be an important statement.
Of course, that passage hasn't happened just yet, and then there's the Senate, but the political implications of even starting to move in this direction are many. I'm joined now by Duke University economist and professor of public policy and African American Studies, William Darity. He's also the co-author of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Professor Darity, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That opening package got us quickly from General Sherman's wartime order to now, but a lot has happened, I think, in the last 3 decades politically to make these conversations even able to happen. Talk about what has changed.
I think there's been a sea change in public attitude, actually. If you go back to the year 2000, surveys that were taken assessing American attitudes towards reparations as monetary payments to Black Americans for both the long-term effects of slavery as well as Jim Crow led to only 4% of white Americans endorsing such a plan. But if we get to the year 2018 or so, that percentage had risen to 16. Not spectacular, but 4 times as high as the original proportion. And then in the year 2021, at mid-year, a UMass Amherst survey indicated that close to 30% of white Americans endorsed monetary payments as reparations for Black Americans. It would be difficult to unpackage exactly what all the factors have been in creating that change in attitude. But we do know that there was a very sharp response to the year 2020 with the combination of the pandemic and the international outcry over police killings of unarmed blacks triggered by George Floyd's murder.
I think the protests over those unarmed killings of Black people did a lot to focus the nation's attention on the topic of equity and making things more fair. I wonder, does that, in your view, paired with the wealth gap framing of your book, make the issue more palatable to people?
I'm not sure if palatable is the proper word, but I think that there are more and more people who have the view that this is the just and appropriate step to take in a nation that has long denied its Black American citizens whose ancestors were enslaved here full citizenship.
And yet, opposition still remains high. You referenced that national poll from UMass Amherst last April. It showed 62%, more than half of Americans, did not support the idea of the federal government making cash payments to the descendants of slaves, while only 38% did. I want to note that when you break that question out by race, the majority of Asians and Blacks do support the idea, while the majority of Latinos and the majority of whites do not. Among all of those who oppose the idea, the most commonly cited reason was that descendants of U.S. slaves do not deserve cash payments. There were also many who believe it's too hard to put a dollar amount on the impact of slavery, and that the descendants of slaves are treated equally in society today. Professor Darity, I know you've faced all of these arguments before. What do you say to folks who suggest the present-day descendants of U.S. slaves don't deserve reparations, or that the concept attempts to put a dollar amount to America's heinous institution?
So in our book, From Here to Equality, Kirsten Mullen and I make the argument that if we were to look specifically at the racial wealth gap, the difference in net worth between Blacks and whites in the United States, we would identify a key indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of what our colleague Bill Spriggs calls stolen opportunity, or the cumulative intergenerational effects of white racism in the United States. And those effects are visited upon living Black Americans. I would include on the list of atrocities that are relevant to the current conditions of Black Americans, I would include not only slavery, but nearly 100 years of legal segregation in the United States, a series of massacres that took place north, south, east, and west, 100 of them, between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War II, where Black lives were taken and Black property was seized and appropriated by the white terrorists. And then in the 20th century, when the federal government makes a transition from allocating assets on the basis of land distribution to supporting asset building via home ownership, the measures that the federal government took to support home ownership were heavily discriminatorily applied to the benefit of building a white middle class, but failing to build a comparable Black middle class. So there's a whole array of government policies leading up to the present moment that have produced the racial wealth gap. And that gap is in the vicinity of $14 trillion, somewhere along the lines of about $840,000 on average per household. And we think that that's what should set the target for a reparations plan, that it should be a bill of at least $14 trillion that's placed upon the United States Congress for the purposes of addressing a debt that has not been paid for 157 years or so. You mentioned, or your prelude mentioned at the outset that in 1865, General Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15, which was the foundation for the original act that produced the claim or promise of 40 acres per Black household. And you noted that the legislation provided for 400,000 acres of land. That's not correct. It actually provided for 5.3 million acres of land, stretching from the Sea Islands of South Carolina to northern Florida, bordered by the St. Johns River. Only 400,000 acres were actually allotted to 40,000 of the freedmen out of 4 million freedmen. only 400,000 acres were allotted before President Andrew Johnson reversed the land distribution scheme and eliminated the commitment to the 40-acre land grants.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Professor Darity. That's why it's wonderful to have you on. Going back to some of the arguments against reparations here, I want to play a clip we have of U.S. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
No one currently alive was responsible for that. And I don't think we should be trying to figure out how to compensate for it. First of all, it'd be pretty hard to figure out who to compensate. We've had waves of immigrants as well who've come to the country and experienced dramatic discrimination of one kind or another.
Professor Darity, I think you've already addressed part of the 2 points that he's making, the enduring effects of the institution that we see today. But
I'd also like to add that we do have an institution that's responsible for the atrocities he's describing that still exist, and that's the federal government.
Of course. You've also come up with a pair of criteria for determining who should be paid reparations. One, that they demonstrate a connection to an ancestor that was enslaved in the U.S., and two, that they self-identified as Black, Negro, or African American for a little over a decade before any programs around reparations were implemented. Tell us a bit about your rationale for that lineage standard and that self-identity standard. It solves the problem Leader McConnell is raising, but I think folks would also argue it leaves quite a bit of people out.
Well, if we estimate that there are approximately 45 million Blacks living in the United States today, if approximately 10% are folks who arrived after the passage of the civil rights legislation, there were very few Black immigrants to the United States prior to the passage of the civil rights legislation. Probably less than 1% of the Black population in the United States. We're ultimately talking about 40 million people who would be eligible recipients for reparations. So it's not clear that we're leaving a lot of people out, but the people who are being left out are the folks who arrived here long after the cumulative effects of federal policies on the determination of Black wealth had been put into place. These are also individuals who do not share an ancestry that is linked to the newly emancipated who were denied the 40-acre land grants at the outset. That's what created the debt that's relevant to the problem or the case for reparations. And that debt is a debt that is owed to the individuals who are descendants of the persons who were formerly enslaved in the United States.
Professor Darity, we have about 30 seconds left here, but I want to make sure that I ask you, where does your passion to keep pushing for reparations come from, and how have you not lost hope all of this time?
Well, as I said at the outset, there's actually been a sea change in American attitudes in the proper direction. So that actually gives me hope. But about 30 years ago, when I first started working on this issue, I reached the conclusion that since it is so much the right thing to do, it's something that I would need to work for and continue to work for, regardless of how long the odds are of reparations actually happening. America will never provide its Black citizens with the full material conditions for citizenship unless it provides reparations at the national level.
Professor William Darity, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Turning closer to home now, here in Massachusetts, political winds have also shifted, prompting a few cities and towns to take actions on reparations. In Amherst this week, town officials voted unanimously to start drafting a request for a special state law that would define reparations as a public purpose. That would allow the town to start distributing money from its reparations fund without funneling the cash through a nonprofit or running afoul of the current state law that prohibits spending municipal dollars on private or individual purposes.
This does feel like the way to most directly benefit the African heritage community with the most flexibility and keep the most sort of control within the African heritage community. And also protect the town. Because we know that there will be legal and all sorts of opposition to distributing reparation benefits.
Now, the town is just getting started with drafting this request for a special law, which must be approved by the state legislature and the governor. That, of course, could prompt a broader discussion and carry implications for the other cities and towns that have begun work on local reparations, like Boston, where the city council is currently weighing a measure to set up a commission to study whether, why, and how Boston should move to implement reparations.
We have witnessed segregation and injustice, but let's be clear, the solution to injustice is justice. And the solution to segregation is community coming together as one to fight towards a common goal.
Now, that Reparations Commission hasn't been formally approved yet, so there's a lot to explore. I'm joined now by two people framing the conversation: Jemadari Kamara, chair of the Africana Studies Department at UMass Boston and a co-author of this proposal, and Tammy Tai, deputy director of King Boston, a program of the Boston Foundation, which would have a seat on the proposed 15-member commission. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Tammy Tai, I want to start with you and also get Professor Kamara to weigh in. We heard that a lot has happened nationwide to get Congress to the point of possibly approving a study of reparations. But there's a lot that's happened locally, like here in Boston, to get us to this point too. Talk about some of the political factors at play here.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. Super excited for what's happening in Boston. Advocates have been at this for many years. And within the last 2 years, right, within our pandemic, racial reckoning has brought together this moment of hope and possibility. And so we've been leveraging this particular moment, pushing on the city council. We've got, you featured Councilor Mejia, and under her leadership to put forth hearings around reparations and to move from not just studying, but actually taking action. So we've had a very robust community of scholars, activists. Dr. Kamara, as we stand on his shoulders, stand by him in this long time effort and fight for reparations here locally. And it's going to happen in the city.
Professor Kamara, would you add anything to that?
Yes, the struggle in which we've been engaged is one that includes a broad range of community-based organizations, as well as now elected officials who are bringing this to the forefront. We've had a number of organizations who we're suggesting should serve on the commission once it is established, including the NAACP. Of course, it has a long history in this work. The New Democracy Coalition that's been in the forefront very recently with regard to activities around Faneuil Hall and other community organizing, as well as researchers at the institution. And I think it is important to focus on the idea of the commission that we're putting forward through the ordinance on Boston as directly linked to the challenge that was established first in the 20th century here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You mentioned HR 40, the national legislation. In fact, HR 40, or the bill that is in the House of Representatives, was modeled on the legislation filed in 1988
Bill Owens,
by, at that time, Senator Bill Owens. And HR 40 has now come to fruition, and we hope it will be passed in the House at least. But the model, it's important, originated here in the 20th century in Massachusetts with his legislation, which was never heard in the Commonwealth, but we at the local level are pushing this forward.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I think there are a number of folks who would argue that because Massachusetts was one of the first states to abolish slavery, that means this state and this city, in their view, bears very little in the way of responsibility for the harms of slavery. Do either of you ever get asked, what is it that Boston did to warrant this exploration and the possible payment of reparations to Black residents? Either of you?
I mean, we were the first to abolish, but also first to legalize slavery. So we have a very long history to repair, and to repent from. And we have to remember, when we're talking about reparations, Yes, it stems from MAFA, from chattel slavery, but we're talking about a whole 400 plus years of Jim Crow segregation, the continuing inequities that stem from the notion of the supremacy of whites over Black. And so in that case, Boston is culpable. Boston's infrastructure, economic systems have all been built on the backs of stolen labor. And so we cannot deny that and just say, yes, we abolished slavery. So that's so much in our past. We're very much implicated in this country's history.
The issue of the intergenerational wealth transfers, I think, are exceedingly important. While slavery has been the specific issue that, and unpaid labor, obviously, during this period, there's a wealth of documentation focusing on, as it has been entitled, slavery by another name, which is the last century and a half of the exploitation of Black labor in this country. There's a book by that title by Douglas Blackman that documents the positioning and marginality of Black labor throughout this century and a half, so that it institutionally has continued. And I think one of the things we're really focusing upon is the systemic and institutional racism that has been embodied by state policies and has impacted both the expansion of wealth in the private sector as well as the nonprofit institutions that are also culpable in the issue.
Turning now to the question of who would be eligible for reparations, I think this is a hard one to sort out in a place like Boston, where our Black population is so varied from folks all across the diaspora. And to that point, I wonder if either of you agree with Professor Darity's assessment of how reparations would be allotted to folks who can demonstrate a connection to an ancestor who was enslaved in the U.S. and folks who self-identify as Black, African American, or Negro for the last 10 to 12 years. Do we like that criteria, either of you? Professor Kamara, let's start with you.
The issue as we begin to look and explore solutions to this long-standing problem, I think we need to reflect upon in a broader way. We have to rethink the entire question of solution. And while we're using reparations, which is a tool of public policy, it has implications both for the private sector and nonprofit sectors, as well as the public sector. And in that rethinking, there are both residual collective benefits as well as individual ones. We're talking about a system of institutional oppression that is not only focused on Boston and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the United States, but it is global. It is the functioning of the expansion of monopoly capital is what in fact produced slavery in the very beginning. And therefore we have to consider capitalism as a global system, and how do we engage now in solutions that have both individual and collective benefits. That's why we're looking to a commission to help us in this process as a community that has been harmed, to begin to address collective solutions to such a problem. And I think our rethinking will allow us to focus on broader kinds of models that would not only be tied individually to the individual harms, but the collective community harms that would allow us perhaps to begin to think about land trusts and other kinds of alternatives that could have collective community benefits as well as individual.
Tammy Tai, it sounds like Professor Kamara is saying there needs to be a global framing of this issue. What do you think?
No, absolutely concur. When we talk about reparations, we have to underscore reparations as a process, not just a one-time, one-and-done transactional kind of notion. And so as a part of reparations, yes, there will be opportunities to consider individual recompense that will maybe come in financial ways, for which we'll have to define some type of criteria. But the overall goal of reparations is this community healing. right? So this rethinking, reframing of reparations as this full process of community repair begs us to consider more than just the singular lineage question. And as you said, right, the Black population in Boston is very diverse. And so we want to have conversations that unite rather than divide in face of this conversation and this movement.
And the piece before the council now would give this 15-member commission a lot of space to define reparations and start devising how that might take shape. Talk about some of the ways we've seen reparations manifest in other places. Like, how might that look? And what are you two supportive of?
Well, I think the manifestation of the process that is currently going on, we will see in a variety of different locations. Some of them are municipal, such as other communities. Evanston, Illinois is one, Asheville. There are state level commissions, such as in California. The state of California currently has passed a bill where there is a commission actively engaged in exploring these kinds of issues. Also at the international level, we have a national African American Reparations Commission, but it is modeled on the Caribbean Community or CARICOM Commission that is exploring these issues engaged with European countries. So this is not just a domestic question. It has international implications for all of those actors who were involved initially in the expansion of the Ma'afa or the slave trade that produced the consequences that we are experiencing in the wealth gap that we have here in Boston. We're very familiar with the Federal Reserve report that identified the domestic gap of $247,500 as the median income of white households, and Black households is 8. I mean, that kind of disparity obviously produces a community which has the absence of a base of wealth to be able to generate and contribute at the level in which we could expand the entire economy if opportunities were opened at that level. In Evanston, they have focused on the specific question of housing and have now generated a means through an innovative use of a cannabis tax to repair the injustices around that occurred in the housing market for individual households. California is exploring other options that will be specific to the resolution of the problems of the residents there.
Professor, I want to get Tammy Tai to weigh in on a different question before we wrap up. We don't have any statewide polling, but Tammy Tai, if you had to guess, what percentage of Massachusetts folks would support the idea of reparations?
When we're talking about financial cash payments?
Very quickly.
Yeah, I would think maybe 30 to 40%.
Excellent. Jemadari Kamara, Tammy Tai, we have to leave it here. There's obviously more to discuss, but thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight. Adam will be back next week. Tell us what you think. The addresses are on your screen. Thank you for watching, and good night.